Okay. Samach Ches Maveh, 68b. Okay, I don't have any trips planned for a little while. Let's go. The Hector Chalavav. So the Gemara had a discussion about whether or not. So the Gemara says, fine. First, the Mishnah stated that everyone agrees the burning of the fats of the Korban Pesach can be done on Shabbos, right? So we've been talking about Erev Pesach and Shabbos that coincide, right? It's Erev Pesach and it's Shabbos. What is allowed to be done? What is not allowed to be done? Everyone agrees that the burning of the fats, right? They'd slaughter the animal and then they would take the fats and they would put the fats on the Mizbeach. Everyone agrees that would take place on Shabbos, which falls on Erev Pesach. Says the Gemara, Tanya's son of the Brisa, Rav Shimon would say, said, Chaviva mitzvah b'shaita. Look how beloved, look how precious it is for a mitzvah to be performed in its ideal time. We know that burning of the fats, the limbs, and all the different fats could be done the entire night. When it comes to Korban Pesach, right, you slaughter the animal and then you have these fats. Those fats technically could be brought onto the mizbeach the entire night. Right? So imagine, if I were asking the question, if you didn't know any better, it was Erev Shabbos and Erev Pesach. So you slaughter the animal. We know we have to slaughter because we have to have the animal available to be eaten on, as soon as Shabbos is over, when Pesach begins. Okay. But what about the burning of the fats? Technically, it could have been done the whole night. So why would we go ahead and violate Shabbos with those fats? Well, let's just wait, hold off, and burn them later that evening because technically it's kosher. And therefore you won't have to override Shabbos by bringing those fats. Nonetheless, the Mishnah says everyone agrees you bring those fats on Shabbos itself. Why? Because this principle that doing a mitzvah in its ideal time is such a precious thing. And that's what he's saying. Even though you could have technically brought these fats the entire night, okay? Nonetheless, we don't wait until nightfall, but rather, since it's ideal to burn the fats at its ideal time, meaning right away, therefore they're burnt right away. Again, let me just say this again. Bottom line is you slaughter the Korban Pesach. It's Shabbos and Erev Pesach. So you slaughter Korban Pesach, that we know everyone agrees you have to do. And then the Mishnah says you could take those fats, which you brought on the Mizbeach, and even though technically you have the whole night to burn them on the Mizbeach, nonetheless, our sages understood that you bring them on the Mizbeach then. Even though burning something on a fire on Shabbos, normally not done, but since doing a mitzvah in its ideal time, meaning doing the mitzvah right away over here, is a very precious thing, therefore we allow that to override Shabbos as well. Okay, so you see how important it is to do a mitzvah in its proper time. There's a lot of discussion around which mitzvahs is it pertinent to. A lot of discussion, let's say, about doing a bris first thing in the morning, right? There is this idea it's supposed to be done on the 8th day. So, do you have to do it first thing in the morning? Can you do it a little bit later in the day? Okay, but bottom line is there is certainly an ideal to do it earlier in the day because of the same principle that we always try doing things immediately as soon as they're available. That is, so we do mitzvahs as soon as possible. In this example, it's to the point that it overrides Shabbos. Okay, now the next part of the Mishnah had a dialogue between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about whether or not if you have an animal that is outside the tchum, okay, and it has to be brought from outside the tchum, or you have an animal that needs to be carried into the Beis HaMikdash, right? Those are both rabbinic laws. Or you have an animal where it has a wart, and the only way to make it kosher is to remove the wart, right? Even if it could be done in a rabbinic fashion, in a way that's not with a utensil, it can be done with one's hand, whatever. All those things, Rabbi Yeshua said you can't do them. Rabbi Eliezer said you're allowed to do them on Shabbos. Again, we're talking about when Shabbos and Erev Pesach coincide. Rabbi Eliezer says no, you're allowed to do them, even though they are preliminary types of things. Right, things which could have been done, meaning these are all things which could have been done on Friday, right? I could have technically brought my animal from outside the tchum on Friday. I could have carried it on Friday. I could have removed the wart on Friday. Nonetheless, Rabbi Eliezer says I'm allowed to do it on Shabbos, which is Erev Pesach. And his rationale, his proof was the following. He said that what was his proof? His proof was he said that it makes sense because since the Torah allows you to slaughter, everyone agrees you're allowed to slaughter the animal, which is biblical. I'm allowed to slaughter. Everyone agrees on Shabbos Erev Pesach, I'm allowed to slaughter my Korban Pesach. That's Doraisa. So if I could do a Doraisa, certainly I could do a Durabanan. I could go ahead and do a Durabanan, like carry my animal, or move it, walk from beyond the tchum, or take off the wart in a rabbinic fashion. If I could do a biblical thing, I for sure could do a rabbinic thing. That is what Rabbi Eliezer says. Yeshua says, what are you talking about? He says, look at a regular Yom Tov. On a regular Yom Tov, I'm allowed to slaughter an animal so I could eat it, right? But I can't go ahead and do any rabbinic actions. I'm not allowed to bring it from beyond the tchum. I'm not allowed to carry it on Yom Tov. I'm not allowed to do any of these things on Yom Tov. So clearly, we see that even on a regular Yom Tov, you see that biblical things are waived, rabbinic things are not always waived, right? So that's Rav Yeshua's argument. And Rav Eliezer says back to him, he says, what kind of proof are you bringing me? How can you bring me a proof from a regular Yom Tov where you're just talking about you want to have a meal? How can you bring a proof from a regular Yom Tov to Karban Pesach, which is a full-fledged mitzvah to do on that day? That is a summary of the Mishnah that we said. Now let's go back to the Gemara is going to analyze the statements that were made by both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. So the Mishnah said, Harkavasa va'asa, okay, that a person's allowed to go ahead, carry the karban from the, carry the karban, or you could bring it out from outside the tchum, or you could sever its wart. Now, severing its wart would technically be a violation of gozes. There's a prohibition against shearing an animal. Shearing an animal is like to pull out its hair. So popping a wart or removing a wart would be an extension of gozes of shearing. Okay, the Gemara asks the question. The Gemara says the second column on 68b1. Or we have a contradiction because there's a Mishnah in Eruvin, which I'm sure you all remember, which says Choslin Yabelis Migdash of Aloba Medina. You're allowed to sever an animal's wart by hand on Shabbos in the Beis HaMikdash, but not in the provinces. Okay, but if it's done with an instrument, it's forbidden. It's forbidden both here, meaning in the Beis HaMikdash, and in the provinces. Okay, so you see from the Mishnah that in the Beis HaMikdash, you are allowed to go ahead and do it by hand. Again, one more time. We have our Mishnah, which said which has a machlokas about whether or not you're allowed to remove the wart. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer says you're allowed to. The Tana Kama of our Mishnah said you are not allowed to. However, we have a Mishnah in Eruvin which says explicitly that everyone agrees that if it's done, that if you do it with your hand, you are allowed to do it. So why does our Mishnah over here in Pesachim say it cannot be done at all, seemingly, and the Mishnah in Eruvin says you are allowed to do it by hand? It seems to be a contradiction. So Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yosef Chanina, these two Amoraim, Rabbi Eliezer and Yosef Chanina, explain that there's no contradiction. One approach is to say that both our Mishnah here in Pesachim and the Mishnah in Eruvin are talking about removal of a wart by hand. Habalacha, but the one that says it's forbidden is when it's a moist wart. Okay, if it's a moist wart, it's still really attached to your skin. To remove it even by hands would be rabbinically prohibited. Habayabasha, as opposed to a dry one, okay, which is the Mishnah there. If it's a dry one, the dry one's not really attached to it. In other words, it basically disintegrates. If it's a dry wart, you just like kind of scratch it and it just disintegrates. That's going to be allowed. That's going to be allowed. Okay, so one approach is to say that both of them are talking about by hand. Okay, but one of them is talking about if it's moist. If it's moist, it cannot be done. If it's dry, it is allowed to be done. The Chadam, or another approach is to say that both this Mishnah and the Mishnah in Eruvin are talking about a moist one. V'lo no constriction. Habayad. Okay, the one that says it's permitted is allowed by hand. And habachli, the one that says it's not allowed, is saying it's being done with an instrument. Okay, so. Basically the basic difference between these two approaches is that the first approach is to say that even by hand, which is rabbinically prohibited, it has to be done Erev Shabbos. Right? In other words, again, approach number one is saying that even if it's done by hand, if it's a moist one, it cannot be done. Right? Even though that's rabbinic because it's being done by hand, not the typical fashion. Normally, you would break a wart with a utensil. Doing it by hand is a little bit of a shinoi. Nonetheless, it's still not allowed to be done because if it's a rabbinic prohibition, it should have been done because at the end of the day, it could have been done before Shabbos. So even though it's rabbinic, it should have been done before Shabbos. A second approach is to say that no, as long as you're doing it in a rabbinic fashion, you're doing it by hand, you could do it on Shabbos. Okay, says the Gemara 68b2. The Gemara analyzes these two approaches. Okay, according to the one who wanted to reconcile the two Mishnayos by saying that one is being done by hand and one is being done by instrument, my time alo amar biyad v'lo kasha v'lacha v'yavesha. Why doesn't that approach like the other approach? Why don't they say the answer of saying that one that it's moist versus dry? Why is that not a good answer? Amalacha yevesha mifrach pricha. He says that it can't. So the answer to that approach is to say that if it's being done, if the answer is that it's dry, then there would be no reason for the Mishnah to say it has to be done by hand. Once it's dry, you can even do it with the utensil. So why would the Mishnah have to specify that it's done by hand? And therefore, this approach rejects that answer of distinguishing between dry and moist and says they both must be talking about moist. And the answer is one's being done by utensil and one's being done by hand. Because if you're telling me that it's dry, it would even be allowed to be done with an instrument. And according to the one who says that both Mishnayos are talking about removal by hand, lokasha, habalacha, habiyavesha, and the answer is that that one of them is talking about a moist one, one of them is talking about a dry one. My time amar idibidibalacha, velokasha biyad b'habachli. Why doesn't he answer? like the other one did, by saying that no, the difference is one is being done by hand, one's being done by utensil. Amalach kli haktani hasam. He says there's no reason to specify, to say that one of them is talking about utensil, because it says already explicitly in Erevin. It says over there in bechli kan v'kan aser. Once it already said in Erevin that that if it's being done with an instrument, then it's aser to be done, whether it's in the base of Mikdash or elsewhere, it cannot be done with the utensil. So there'd be no reason for the Mishnah to then go ahead and over here be talking about being done with the utensil, since it already specified explicitly in Erevin that being done with the utensil is aser. The idach, the other one responds to that, no problem. You're right, even though it said explicitly in Erevin that if it's done with a utensil that it's forbidden, that's forbidden, but it still makes sense to mention over here. Why? Plug to the Rabbi Yeshua aslash minan. It's coming to tell me that even though the class Rabbi Yeshua says it's aser, Rabbi Eliezer does permit it, and that's why it's being repeated to tell me that it's a machlokas and not necessarily agreed upon by everyone. Okay, the bottom line is there is no. So let's just quickly summarize. We have a Mishnah over here which tells us that Rabbi Yeshua says you cannot remove a wart. Rabbi Eliezer says you can. We have a Mishnah over there saying that a wart cannot be removed, and there seems to be. So how do you reconcile these two Mishnayos? One way is to say that we're distinguishing between a dry one, which is going to be much more permissible because the fact that if it's dry, it just kind of disintegrates, whereas over here we're talking about a moist one. Alternatively, over here we're talking about being done with a utensil, right? And over there we're talking about being done by hand. Okay, those are the ways to reconcile the two Mishnayos. Now, the last part of our Mishnah, which we're going to analyze, is Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua. Again, Rabbi Yeshua said, Rabbi Eliezer, how could you tell me that you should be able to do rabbinic prohibitions? You see, on a regular Yom Tiv, you're allowed to do certain biblical violations, otherwise prohibited biblical activities like shechita, like slaughtering, but we do not allow you to do rabbinic things. Again, on a regular Yom Tiv, you are not allowed to carry something from beyond the tchum, which is rabbinic. You are allowed to slaughter something. So you see, just because biblical things are allowed doesn't mean you waive all rabbinic things. And Rabbi Eliezer said back to him, he said, what kind of proof are you bringing me? I'm talking about Korban Pesach, which is a mitzvah, full-fledged mitzvah. You have to bring Korban Pesach. You're talking about bring something from beyond the tchum, like you want to have some meat on Yom Tov. That's not a mitzvah. That's not a mitzvah. So the Gemara now points out, so Rabbi Eliezer, this is a quote to Maim, Shechita, etc. Rabbi Yeshua Tameh. So what does Rabbi Yeshua respond to that? In other words, Rabbi Eliezer is saying a very good argument. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that how could you bring me a proof from, going ahead and bringing some meat from beyond the tchum, a piece of meat, an animal from beyond the tchum on a regular Yom Tov, and the fact that that's prohibited, that's not a riot, that's not a proof against my point, because there on Yom Tov, bring meat from beyond the tchum, that's not a mitzvah. That's you're hungry. That's not a mitzvah. I'm talking about Korban Pesach, which is a mitzvah. So how does Rabbi Yeshua answer that? Rabbi Yeshua, let's the Gemara says Rabbi Yeshua actually holds, according to Rabbi Yeshua, it actually is a mitzvah. Why? He says Simchas Yom Tov Nami Mitzvahi, because he holds the rejoicing on Yom Tov, which includes having meat, is actually a full-fledged mitzvah. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer was saying, how can you bring me a proof from a regular Yom Tov? Right? What was Rabbi Yeshua's proof? Rabbi Yeshua said, look, on a regular Yom Tov, I could slaughter an animal, doraisa, but I can't bring an animal from beyond the tchum, which is rabbinic. And Rabbi Yeshua said, and therefore, you also can't on Erev Pesach bring an animal from beyond the tchum. And right, and Rabbi Eliezer says, what are you talking about? I'm trying to prove that it can be done on Erev Pesach when it's a full-fledged mitzvah because it's a Korban Pesach. You're bringing me a proof from a regular Yom Tov. You're trying to bring an animal so you can have a nice Yom Tov meal. That's not a proof. So the Gemara says, no, it is a proof because Rabbi Yeshua holds that having meat on Yom Tov is actually a full-fledged mitzvah. Just like having a Korban Pesach on a Pesach is a mitzvah, so too having meat on a regular Yom Tov, that is a mitzvah. Okay, now we're going to prove this from a brisa. The Tanya saw it in a brisa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Ein lo la'adam b'Yom Tov ella o ochel v'shoseh o yosh v'shoneh. Rabbi Eliezer holds that on Yom Tov you have a choice. You could either spend the day learning, or you could spend the day eating. You could do whatever you want. It's your choice. But you don't have an obligation to necessarily eat and drink on Yom Tov. Rabbi Shua Omer Chalkei. Rabbi Shua disagrees. He says, no, you split it. He says, on Yom Tov, you have an obligation to do both. You have an obligation to learn Torah on Yom Tov and to daven on Yom Tov, but also you have a full-fledged obligation to eat. So you see, Rabbi Shua holds that eating, and specifically eating meat, is a mitzvah to do on Yom Tov. From Rabbi Yochanan, and fine. So the bottom line is that's the end of the explanation of our mission. Now we go on a whole tangent about this whole discussion about eating meat on Yom Tov and how we're supposed to spend our Yom Tov day. They're both learned it from the same pasuk. One pasuk says there should be a day of gathering for Hashem. Okay, 68b3. Another pasuk says that the day of gathering should be for you. So is it for Hashem or is it for you? Rabbi Eliezer says, Okul Hashem, Okul Lachem. What it means to say is that you have a choice. You could spend Yom Tov for you, or you could spend Yom Tov for God. You could spend the day davening and learning and not eating, or you could spend the day eating. It's your choice. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you divide it. Part of the day should be for you, meaning you should be eating and drinking. Part of the day should be for Hashem, meaning there should be davening and learning. Okay, so fine, bottom line is you see that Rabbi Yeshua holds that you have an obligation on Yom Tov to go ahead and eat meat. And therefore he was saying it was a good proof from a regular Yom Tov to Erev Pesach, which falls out on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Hakol Modem Atzeres, everyone agrees on Shavuos, although there is a dispute, meaning on a regular Sukkot day or Pesach day, Rabbi Eliezer is saying you're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to fast. You're allowed to just be learning and davening. You'd be allowed to fast. And Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you have to do both. But everyone agrees on Shavuos that you need to eat food. You need to eat meat specifically. Okay, for all those who just have dairy on Shavuos, not so good. You're really supposed to there's an obligation to have at least some meat on Yom Tov. My time, and what's the reason? Yom Shnit B'Torahu. It's the day the Torah was given. Amarabba. Okay, so bottom line is, what does that mean? What that means is that since it's a day, we want to demonstrate that since Hashem gave us the Torah, we are so happy. We're so incredibly happy. We don't see it as a yoke. We don't see the Torah as something which is overbearing. We see something which we are so happy about, and therefore on Shavuos specifically, it's important to eat meat. Amarabba kol modem b'Shabbos v'nam lechem. Everyone agrees on Shabbos, you also have to have food. My time, meaning you can't be fasting. My time across Shabbos oneg, because Shabbos is called a day of delight. And if you're going to be fasting, it's not a day of delight. So you're supposed to have food, you're supposed to have meat. Rav Yosef kol modem b'Purim to be in Naim lechem. Also on Purim, you should have a suda. My time, pasuk says, you may mishta b'simcha ksibei. It refers to Purim as days of feasting and rejoicing. Mar b'reid Ravina kulashata haviyasam tanisa. Mar the son of Ravina would fast the entire year. Presumably daytime, he would eat at night. He'd fast every day of the year. Levan me atzarta puria umal yom dichbur. Except for Shavuos, Purim, and Erev Yom Kippur. Atzeres, the reason he didn't fast the reason he ate on Shavuos is Yom Shnei B'Torah. It's the day the Torah was given. Puria, the reason he didn't fast on Purim is he made Mishnah B'Simcha Ksiv, because it says the day of feasting and rejoicing. Mal Yom Kippur, the day of Erev Yom Kippur, he also didn't fast. Tanichia Bar Ram Midifti, because there's the following Bryce was taught. V'nisim B'Sav Shasech Matish L'Chodesh. Pasuk says you shall afflict yourself on the 9th of the month of Tishrei. Ask the Gemara, V'chidhishay Misanim. Do you fast the 9th? Yom Kippur is the 10th of the day. What does it mean, fast the 9th? You fast the 10th. The reason the pasuk says fast the 9th is to teach you that anyone who eats and drinks on the 9th of the month, it says if you fasted both on the 9th and the 10th. Okay, it's a fascinating limud, but the bottom line is that there's a mitzvah, as we know, there's a mitzvah to eat on Erev Yom Kippur. Why the Torah frames it as fasting, we don't have time to discuss, but that's the bottom line. Rav Yosef Yom Datzar Amar, Rav Yosef on Shavuos would say, Avdi li igla tilsa, prepare for me a third-born calf. That's seen as like a very, tasty calf is the one that's the third-born to the mother, not the first, not the second, but the third. That was seen as a very tasty thing. He said, prepare me like good meat. Amar, and he would say, Ilo ha yoma dekagarim, had it not been for this day of Shavuos, Kama Yosef Ika B'Shuka, there'd be many Yosef in the marketplace. Now that we have Shavuos, now that we have a day that we were given the Torah, then all of a sudden I was elevated. I'm no longer just a regular Yosef. I am now someone special. So we have to recognize that on Shavuos, and the way that it's understood by many is that Shavuos is simply the giving of the Torah, even without learning any Torah. Certainly if we learn Torah, but just the giving of the Torah transforms us into a different being, and that's what we celebrate on Shavuos. That we celebrate that we are different people. The fact that Hashem gave us Torah that transforms us into someone different. Rav Sheshes called Tlas and Yom Mahadle Talmud. Every 30 days, he would review everything he learned. Pretty good, right? Every 30 days, imagine you review everything you learned. He would stand on the bolt of the doorway. We'll come back to why he did that. And he would exclaim, and he would say, Chadai nafshai, Chadai nafsha, lecha karai lecha tonight. He said, rejoice my soul, because I've learned and studied for you. Ask the Gemara, Eini, Vamar Abelazar, Ilmala Torah Leniskai Mishmayim Ba'aretz. The Torah, the Torah is not for me. The Torah, he said, if we don't have Torah learning, then the entire world will not exist. Shnemar Im Lo Vrisi Yom V'Layla, Chukos Shmayim Ba'aretz Lo Samti. Hashem says, it had not been for the Torah, the world would cease to exist. We need to be learning every moment, or else there wouldn't be any world. So why is he saying he's doing it for himself, for his neshama? You need the Torah for the world. So the Gemara answers, really, Rav Sheshes was young at the time. Meikar ki avid inish, adait nafshe ka'avid. When a person is young, first you focus on yourself, but as you get older, you recognize you're not doing it for yourself, you're not just doing it for your own spiritual existence. Every time we learn, we are keeping the world in existence. So Rav Sheshes, when he said those statements, he was young, but as we get older, we have to appreciate that the fact that we're sitting here at 6:20, so 6:46 sometimes, and learning is not for ourselves, but rather we are maintaining the world. I just mentioned very briefly the the Ben Yoyada says, why was he standing by the doorways? Why was he standing by the door hinges? And they answered that a door is very heavy, right? Imagine if the door wouldn't have hinges, it'd be extremely heavy. Sometimes people look at Torah, they say, oh, it's so heavy, it's so hard. But he says, no, but if you have hinges, if you have hinges, then you're able to move it. What are hinges? Hinges is you have the ratzon, you have the desire, then you're able to go ahead, and yes, sometimes Pesachim's hard, and sometimes Erev's hard, whatever it is, but if you have the desire to push forward, if you have the desire to accomplish and to come closer to God and to keep the world existing, then that's why he stood by the doorway, by the hinges, to say that even though it looks like it's so hard, you can accomplish so much if you have the right ratzon and is able to move everything in the right fashion, make it all easy. Have a great day.